The silk of my bridal gown felt like cold water against my skin. My cousin has treated me cruelly my entire life. Now he had the nerve to walk into my wedding. That was when I finally got my revenge. I stared into the vanity mirror, watching my own pupils dilate. Beyond the heavy oak door, the organist began a low, somber melody. My mother hovered behind me, her hands trembling as she adjusted my veil. She looked like a ghost. My mother leaned down, her breath smelling of peppermint and nervous sweat. She whispered that Julian was waiting in the vestibule. She begged me to find him a seat near the front. She said family must always forgive, especially on a day this sacred. I didn't blink or turn to face her. My hands remained perfectly still on the vanity. I was ready. I could feel the weight of the flash drive hidden in my bouquet. My mother did not notice my lack of a wedding ring. The history of his malice played behind my eyes like a flickering film strip. I remembered the year he burned my graduation gown in the driveway. My parents called it a prank. I remembered him stealing my tuition savings and the way Aunt Martha laughed. They always expected me to be the bigger person. They wanted me to be a silent statue in their gallery of lies. I stood up slowly, the heavy fabric of my skirt hissing across the floorboards. I stepped into the hallway where the air was thick with the scent of lilies. Two large men in charcoal suits stood by the entrance. They were not the usual ushers provided by the church. They were professionals I had hired with my own secret accounts. One of them tapped his earpiece and nodded at me. The plan was moving forward without a single hitch. My pulse remained steady and slow. Julian had forced his way inside, unknowingly sitting in a chair rigged for his own destruction. I reached the double doors of the sanctuary. The music swelled into a triumphant roar that vibrated in my chest. I saw Julian sitting in the third row, leaning back with a smirk. He was wearing a white suit, a final insult to my authority. He looked around the room as if he owned the very air we breathed. He thought he was the protagonist of this story. He had no idea that the guests were already looking at their phones. The first vibration hit the room like a physical wave. Julian's smirk faltered as his own phone began to glow in his pocket. I stepped onto the white runner, my eyes locked on his pale face. The screens of every guest illuminated simultaneously with the evidence of his crimes. The soft murmurs of the crowd turned into a sharp, collective gasp. Julian tried to stand, but his legs seemed to fail him. I finally smiled as the first police officer entered through the side door. The sanctuary descended into a chaotic hum as the blue uniforms neared the third row. Julian gripped the wooden pew until his knuckles turned ashen. I kept my pace rhythmic and slow, ignoring my mother's frantic gasping. The guests shifted their gaze from the digital evidence to the man in the white suit. He looked small now, stripped of his usual arrogance. The officer placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down his temple. Julian lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure desperation. He shouted that I was a liar and a thief. The officer didn't hesitate. He forced Julian's arms behind his back. The metal click of the handcuffs echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Aunt Martha stood up, screaming about family loyalty and ruined reputations. My father tried to pull her down, but she shoved him away. The crowd began to film the meltdown on their glowing screens. Julian's eyes met mine. I reached the altar and stood beside my husband. He squeezed my hand, his grip solid and warm. Julian was being dragged toward the side exit, his heels scuffing the carpet. He spat a final curse at me before the heavy doors slammed shut. The church fell into a sudden, ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. Aunt Martha turned her venomous stare toward the altar. She began to walk toward us. Her heels clicked like a countdown on the marble. Aunt Martha stopped at the bottom step, her chest heaving. She hissed that I had destroyed her son for a petty grudge. I didn't flinch or look away from her bloodshot eyes. I told her the money was never hers to spend. She laughed, a sharp sound that lacked any real humor. She claimed my parents had given her permission years ago. My father's face drained of all color at her words. He looked at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. My father stepped forward, his voice cracking like dry wood. He confessed that they had used my inheritance to save the family name. They thought I was strong enough to survive without the extra help. He said Julian was fragile and needed a safety net. I felt a cold realization settle into my bones. My own parents were the architects of the theft. They had traded my future for Julian's comfort. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my lungs. Aunt Martha reached into her clutch and pulled out a crumpled envelope. She tossed it onto the altar with a sneer. She said the bank was already foreclosing on my parents' house. Julian had gambled away the last of the equity weeks ago. My mother let out a high, thin wail from the front row. The secret was out, and the cost was everything they owned. I looked at the envelope. It was addressed to me. It had been hidden for a decade. I opened the yellowed paper and read the neat handwriting. It was a letter from my grandfather, dated 2 weeks before his death. He warned me that the family would try to devour my light. He had set up a secondary trust that no one could touch. The funds were only accessible if I married without their blessing. My husband looked at the paper and smiled. I realized I didn't need their forgiveness or their money. They were the ones who were truly penniless now. I gripped the yellowed letter until my knuckles turned white. The ink was a ghost from a kinder man. My father tried to step closer, his hand outstretched in a hollow plea. I moved the paper out of his reach. He looked at me with eyes full of false regret. I told him he was no longer welcome at my table. He flinched as if I had struck him. The congregation watched every movement with predatory interest. The air in the church felt thin. Aunt Martha let out a sharp, jagged laugh from the aisle. She pointed at the envelope and called it a fabrication. She claimed my grandfather was senile when he wrote those words. My husband stepped in front of me, his shadow long and protective. He told her to leave before the police returned for her too. She recoiled, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. A new threat was brewing in her silence. The church doors groaned open, admitting a blast of humid air. Julian's lawyer marched inside, looking frantic and disheveled. He ignored the gasping guests and headed straight for my father. He held a leather briefcase like a shield against the tension. He whispered something that made my father's knees buckle. My mother rushed to catch him, her veil snagging on a pew. Something had gone wrong with Julian's arrest. The power balance shifted in a single heartbeat. The lawyer announced that the initial charges were being contested. He claimed the digital evidence was inadmissible due to a technicality. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the security guards I had hired. They remained stoic, but their eyes drifted toward the lawyer. Julian was already being processed at the station. If he walked free today, my safety was gone. I felt the hidden flash drive in my boot cut. It was my only remaining leverage. I turned to the lawyer and spoke with icy precision. I told him I had physical bank records, not just digital files. His eyes darted to the yellowed letter in my hand. I lied and said the trust details included Julian's signatures. The lawyer's confidence wavered for a split second. He knew his client was a cornered animal. My father watched us, his mouth hanging open in shock. He realized I was playing a much larger game. I held the winning card. Aunt Martha shrieked that I was blackmailing her family. She lunged toward me, her manicured nails aimed for my face. My husband caught her wrists before she could touch me. The guests stood up, some shouting for her to stop. The sacred space was now a battlefield. Agreed. I felt no fear, only a cold and biting clarity. I told her the police were still waiting outside. She stopped struggling and began to sob. Her pride was finally starting to crumble. The lawyer checked his watch and shook his head slowly. He told my father that the house was officially lost. The bank had sent a final notice via courier 10 minutes ago. My parents looked at each other with hollow, empty expressions. They were homeless and disgraced in front of their peers. I looked at my husband and nodded toward the side exit. We were leaving the ruins behind. Then, I noticed my husband's wedding ring was missing from his hand. I stared at his bare finger as the sanctuary lights flickered. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. I asked him where his gold band had gone. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze darting toward the side entrance. The lawyer was still arguing with my father near the front pew. My husband finally leaned in close, his voice a jagged whisper. He said he had to give it to Julian's lawyer. My breath hitched in my throat. He was paying for Julian's silence. The weight of his betrayal felt heavier than the crown of my veil. I pulled my hand away from his warm grip. He tried to explain that Julian had evidence of his own. It was a secret that could ruin our new life together. I looked at the man I had just married. He was no longer the hero of my story. He was just another person hiding in the shadows. The church felt like it was closing in on me. I felt truly alone. Aunt Martha noticed the distance between us and began to smirk. She sensed a crack in our armor and moved to exploit it. She told the room that some secrets were too dark for sunlight. My husband flinched at her words, his face turning a sickly gray. I realized then that my revenge was far from over. I had to find out what Julian held over him. I reached for my bouquet, feeling the cold flash drive. I needed to act fast. I walked toward the lawyer, my heels clicking like a firing squad. I demanded to see the terms of the agreement they made. The lawyer looked at my husband, seeking some form of silent permission. My husband shook his head, his eyes begging me to stop. I didn't care about his fear or his secrets anymore. I wanted the absolute truth regardless of the cost. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin, blue folder. He handed it to me. I opened the folder and saw a grainy photograph from 10 years ago. It showed my husband standing near Julian at the scene of a fire. I remembered that night. It was the night my family's factory burned down. We all thought it was an electrical accident caused by old wiring. The photo showed my husband holding a red gasoline canister. My world tilted on its axis as the truth surfaced. He wasn't my protector. He was Julian's secret accomplice. The lawyer whispered that Julian had kept the photo for insurance purposes. My husband had been paying him off for a decade to stay quiet. The wedding was supposed to be the final payment for his freedom. I looked at the man I loved with a new, sharp clarity. He had built our relationship on a foundation of ash and lies. He looked at me, tears streaming down his face. He said he did it for us. I felt a sudden, violent urge to scream. I closed the folder and tucked it under my arm firmly. I told the lawyer that the deal was officially off. I would be turning over the photo and the flash drive together. My husband grabbed my arm, begging me to reconsider the consequences. I shoved him back, the silk of my dress tearing at the seam. I walked toward the front doors without looking back at any of them. I heard someone shouting my name from the dark. It was Julian's voice. The heavy church door swung open, revealing Julian standing in the pouring rain. His white suit was soaked through and clung to his frame like a second skin. He had somehow slipped away from the officers during the confusion when the lawyer arrived at the church. His eyes were wide and bloodshot as he stared at the blue folder in my hand. He told me that I was making a terrible mistake for everyone involved. I didn't stop moving toward the stone steps. My husband chased after me, his feet slipping on the wet pavement. Julian blocked my path, his chest heaving with a manic energy. He hissed that the photo wasn't just proof of a crime. He claimed my husband had actually saved him from the flames that night. The red canister was a plant designed to frame them both by someone else. I stopped and looked at the grainy image under the street lamp. The shadows didn't match the light of the fire in the background. My husband caught up and grabbed my shoulder. He begged me to listen to the rest. I shook his hand off and demanded the name of the true arsonist. Julian pointed a shaking finger back toward the open church doors. My father was standing in the shadows of the vestibule, watching us with a hollow stare. He was the one who had insured the factory for triple its worth. He had used Julian and my husband as pawns in his financial game. The realization felt like a sheet of ice sliding down my back. My father was the monster I never saw. My father stepped out into the rain, his face finally showing a jagged, cruel edge. He didn't deny the accusation or offer a single apology. He told me that the money had kept our family afloat for years. He said my husband had accepted a bribe to keep quiet and marry me. My heart stopped beating for a long, painful second. I looked at my husband, searching for a denial that never came. He looked at the ground, his silence confirming the darkest part of the lie. The bribe was the seed money for our first apartment and my engagement ring. Every beautiful moment we shared was purchased with the blood of my family's legacy. I felt a surge of nausea that made the world spin violently. Julian laughed, a wet and choking sound that cut through the thunder. He said he was tired of being the only villain in this play. He wanted everyone to burn down together today. I clutched the folder to my chest. I had to make a final choice. I turned away from all three of them and headed for my car. The engine roared to life, its headlights cutting through the gray sheets of rain. My husband pounded on the glass, shouting that he truly loved me now. I didn't look at him as I shifted into gear and accelerated. I was leaving the wedding, the family, and the lies in my rearview mirror. I had one destination left in mind. I drove toward the local precinct with the folder on the seat. I parked the car and walked into the station, dripping wet and shivering. I handed the blue folder and the flash drive to the sergeant at the desk. I told him I wanted to report an arson and a decade of extortion. He looked at my soaked wedding dress and the fury in my eyes. He started to open the folder but stopped when his phone rang. He listened for a moment and then looked up at me. My husband had just walked into the station lobby. The sergeant stared at the monitor as my husband walked through the automatic glass doors. Rainwater pooled around his expensive leather shoes, staining the station's linoleum floor. He didn't look like a groom anymore. He looked like a man reaching the end of a very long rope. He didn't approach me or the desk. Instead, he sat on a plastic bench and buried his face in his hands. The sergeant looked back at me and asked if I knew the man. I nodded slowly, my wet veil clinging to my neck. I pushed the folder across the high counter, demanding that the sergeant look at the secondary documents. My objective was absolute. I needed a paper trail that my father could never erase with a bribe. The sergeant flipped past the arson photo to the bank statements I had retrieved from the altar. His eyes narrowed as he traced the flow of money from the insurance payout to Julian's private accounts. This was the mechanical evidence of a conspiracy. The station was quiet except for the hum of a vending machine. Everything felt heavy. The sergeant suddenly stood up and walked toward a glass-walled office in the back. He beckoned for another officer to take his place at the front desk. My husband looked up from the bench, his eyes red and searching mine for any sign of mercy. I turned my back to him, focusing on the distorted reflection in the plexiglass. I felt a surge of cold triumph followed by a hollow ache. The officer at the desk told me I needed to wait for a detective. The wait felt like a slow execution. A side door opened, and my father walked into the precinct lobby, flanked by a tall man in a sharp suit. It was the family's head of legal counsel, a man who had known me since I was a child. My father's presence here was an escalation I hadn't prepared for yet. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was his most effective weapon. He walked straight to the counter and placed a hand on my damp shoulder. I flinched away from his touch like it was burning. My father spoke to the officer in a low, authoritative tone that suggested a tragic misunderstanding. He claimed I was suffering from a mental breakdown brought on by wedding stress. He whispered that I had a history of fabricating stories when I felt overwhelmed. The officer's expression shifted from professional interest to cautious doubt. I realized my father was trying to gaslight the entire precinct in real time. He looked at me with a sad, rehearsed smile. He asked me to come home and rest. I felt the trap closing. I reached into my bouquet and pulled out the small, silver flash drive I had hidden. I didn't address my father. I spoke directly to the officer behind the glass. I told him this drive contained the original blueprints of the factory's fire suppression system. It proved the system was manually disabled 3 hours before the first flame erupted. The tall lawyer's face went rigid as he processed the implications. My father's hand dropped from my shoulder as he realized I had more than just a single grainy photo. The power shifted. The lawyer leaned in and whispered something sharp into my father's ear. They both looked at the silver drive as if it were a live grenade. My father's mask of concern finally shattered, revealing the desperate predator underneath. He hissed that I was destroying the legacy he had built for me. I told him he had burned my legacy for a check 10 years ago. The detective finally emerged from the back office and called my name. He ignored my father and gestured for me to follow him alone. I walked past my husband, who was now standing near the doors. He tried to grab my hand, his voice a broken mess of apologies. He said he had the keys to Julian's safety deposit box. It contained the original contract my father had signed with the arsonist. This was the final piece of the puzzle I didn't even know existed. My husband was finally choosing a side, but it was far too late for us. I took the keys from his shaking hand without saying a word. I kept walking. The detective led me into a small, windowless room and shut the door. He sat across from me and laid out the contents of the blue folder. He told me that Julian had just made a full confession at the other precinct. Julian had turned on my father to save himself from a life sentence. The detective looked at the wedding dress and the silver drive on the table. He said this was going to be a very long night for everyone. Then, he mentioned my mother had been taken to the hospital. I stared at the detective as the fluorescent light hummed overhead. My mother's hospital trip felt like another calculated move in my father's game. I asked which facility had admitted her, but the detective only shook his head. He needed me to focus on the silver drive first. The air in the interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. My wet dress felt like lead weights against my skin. I realized my mother might be the only leverage my father had left to use. The detective opened the blue folder and spread the bank records across the table. He pointed to a recurring payment made to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. It did not match the insurance settlement or the bribe money Julian had mentioned. My objective shifted. I had to find where my father was still hiding the bulk of the wealth. The detective asked if I recognized the company name. I looked at the string of letters and felt a chill. It was my grandmother's maiden name. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the heavy silence. An officer leaned in and whispered that my father's lawyer was demanding a private meeting. The detective sighed but motioned for me to step into the hallway. I saw my husband still sitting on the bench, clutching the safety deposit keys. He looked up, his face a map of exhaustion and shame. He told me the bank would open in 4 hours. That was the only window we had before my father's legal team arrived. My father stood by the water fountain, his posture straight and defiant. He looked at me with a cold, predatory gaze that I finally understood. He said that my mother's heart had weakened because of my public accusations. He blamed me for the collapse of her health and the family name. I didn't feel the old guilt rising in my throat. I told him her blood was on his hands, not mine. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, jagged hiss. He whispered that the shell company held the deed to my new house. If I moved forward with the testimony, he would ensure I lost everything I owned. I realized then that my husband hadn't just taken a bribe. He had allowed my father to put our entire future in a cage. The power balance shifted as I saw the depth of their tangled web. My husband wasn't a victim. He was a silent partner in my own containment. I felt a surge of rage. I walked back to my husband and stood over him. I demanded to know if he knew about the deed and the shell company. He couldn't look me in the eye, his silence acting as a loud confession. He said he thought he was protecting me from the truth of the fire. He claimed my father promised to transfer the deed after the wedding. I realized I had married a man who was owned by my enemy. The keys in his hand felt like cold, heavy iron. I snatched the keys from his palm, knowing I had to wait for the morning to open the box, and headed for the exit. My father shouted for me to stop, but I didn't look back at him. I had to get to that safety deposit box before the sun rose. The rain had turned into a thick, gray mist that swallowed the street lamps. I got into my car and locked the doors, my breath coming in short bursts. My phone began to vibrate on the passenger seat. It was a message from an unknown number. The message was a photo of my mother sitting in a chair. She wasn't in a hospital bed or wearing a gown. She was in the back of a black sedan, looking terrified and pale. The caption told me to meet them at the old factory site. My father hadn't sent her to a doctor. He had taken her hostage. My objective changed from financial justice to a rescue mission. I shifted the car into drive and felt the tires spin on the wet asphalt. The drive to the factory took 20 minutes through the winding back roads. The charred remains of the building rose out of the mist like a skeleton. I saw the black sedan parked near the rusted gates, its headlights cutting through the dark. I stopped my car and stepped out, the mud ruining my white silk hem. My father was standing by the car, holding a heavy flare gun. He told me to hand over the drive and the folder immediately. I stayed perfectly still. I looked past him and saw my mother's face pressed against the glass. She was trying to scream, but her mouth was covered with silver tape. My father said this was the final act of our family drama. He didn't care about the money anymore. He only cared about his own survival. I reached into my bouquet, but the small pocket I had soon was empty. I realized I had left the drive on the detective's table in the room during the shuffle. I was empty, handed in the dark. I stood in the mud, my empty hands trembling. The flare gun in my father's grip looked massive against the gray mist. I lied and said the drive was in my shoe. He stepped toward me, his boots crunching on charred timber. I looked at the black sedan where my mother sat bound. The smell of wet ash was suffocating. I needed to lure him away from the car door. He told me to start walking toward the ruins. I complied, my heels sinking deep. We reached the edge of the foundation, where the concrete was cracked. My father demanded the drive again, his face a mask of iron. I told him he had to release my mother first. He laughed and pointed the flare gun at my chest. He said she was his insurance against the detective. I realized he didn't intend for any of us to leave the site. The realization cleared my mind of all remaining fear. I saw a movement in the shadows behind him. My husband emerged from the dark behind the car, holding a heavy tire iron. He didn't shout or make a scene. He struck the back of the sedan's window with a single, violent blow. The glass shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds. My father spun around, his finger tightening on the trigger. I lunged at his arm, redirecting the aim toward the sky. The flare erupted in a blinding scream of red light. It illuminated the entire skeletal frame of the old factory. The red light revealed the detective's car, pulling into the lot. My husband dragged my mother through the broken window, shielding her body. My father fell back into the mud, the empty flare gun slipping from his fingers. He looked at the flashing blue lights and knew it was over. I stood over him, my white dress stained with the soot of our shared past. He begged me to tell them it was an accident. I didn't say a word to him. The detective walked toward us, his boots heavy on the gravel. He held up the silver flash drive I had left behind. He said my husband had recovered it and brought it to him as proof. My husband looked at me, his face covered in glass dust and tears. He had finally done the right thing, but the bribe still sat between us. I helped my mother into the detective's car. She reached for my hand, her eyes full of a new, quiet truth. I realized the Lee was dead. I didn't need their permission to be whole. The truth was that I had always been the strongest of them. I looked at the ruins of the factory and felt a strange peace. My husband stood by his car, waiting for a sign that never came. I got into the detective's vehicle and closed the door. As we drove away, I saw Julian sitting in the back of a second police cruiser. He was finally wearing his own handcuffs.